Hi, I'm Flora Glasspool and this is my research proposal presentation. This project aims to investigate the morphological impact of flooding and future flood risk for the River Don. Flood risk is an increasingly important area of study. This is because global patterns of precipitation and temperature are changing due to climate change. This modifies the occurrence of flooding and means that for certain regions, the frequency, intensity, and spatial extent of flooding will increase. These changing patterns and modified flooding leads to uncertainty in flood management decisions. This creates challenges for policymakers, and is therefore important that they understand how future flooding and climate change will impact flood risk and the extent of flooding, but also the associated probabilities of this risk. A study in 2018 created probabilistic flood maps of Scotland. This figure shows a probabilistic map of low return floods becoming higher in the 2080s. Part A shows the median baseline 1 in 200 year flood, and Part B shows the median baseline 1 in 200 year flood plus 20% of its value. RP stands for the return period of the flood. This figure shows how North East Scotland catchments have a high likelihood of increasingly frequent 1 in 200 year events. It also shows how Aberdeen is at particular risk. The River Don is a catchment with increasing flood risk as a result of climate change. There have recently been several studies which have focused on how climate change impacts flood risk. For example, Beavers in 2020 investigated how climate change projections may influence flood hazard prediction for a 5-kilometre section of the River Don. This study suggested that tipping points existed between the inundation extent and peak flows. This shows the importance of including climate change projections when making probabilistic maps, and also looking at uncertainty when considering flood risk. The study also concluded that climate changes have a huge control over the mean inundation extents for flooding on the River Don. However, this study had little focus on the impact that flooding has on channel morphology. In 2016, a study concluded that changes in bed elevation may actually be more important in determining flood hazard than variations in discharge input. These changes in channel morphology are caused by flooding and can significantly impact flood risk and therefore flood risk projections. This is similar to a study in 2020 which explains how, due to either flood depositing conditions or flood cleaning conditions, channel morphology and flood risk is changed. Flood depositing conditions are where floods supply more sediment than is transported, whereas flood cleaning conditions are where more sediment is transported than supplied. So, to investigate the morphological impact of flooding and future flood risk for the River Don, this project must ask firstly, how does severe flooding morphologically change the River Don? And to do this, I aim to look at how the 2016 flooding impact the channel morphology of the River Don. And the second question is, how do these changes alter the probabilistic flood risk under future projections? And to answer this question, I aim to look at the probabilistic flood extent of future peak flows before and after 2016 flooding. So this figure shows the study area for the project, which is a 5-kilometre section of the River Don, and just upstream of this section is the Parkhill Flow Gorge. This is important for this project because the flow gorge means that data can be accessed for the 2016 floods, where the highest levels in 45 years were reached for the River Don. So flow data can be accessed from this flow gorge. The data required for this project would firstly be digital elevation models, and these come from LiDAR surveys before and after the 2016 flooding. These have a 1 metre resolution, which makes them good for assessing the morphological change of the river. Secondly, future peak flows would be needed, and these can come from the Future Flows hydrology database. This database has daily flow data from 1951 to 2098. Access to this database can be done through the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I'd also need flow data for the 2016 flooding. This can be accessed through the National River Flow Archive for the Parkhill Flow Gorge identified earlier on in the study area. Lastly, Manning's roughness coefficients would be needed for the bed and banks. This can be done by assessing the region and then matching the land use and roughness parameters with coefficients from past studies, such as one in 2006. The methodology for this study would be to firstly assess the morphological change from the 2016 floods, then to build hydrological models for before and after these floods and run them with the future flows hydrology database, and then to create probabilistic inundation rasters, and then from these probabilistic flood maps. The last step would be to analyse the results. The figure on the right shows an example of what this project aims to create. This figure is a probabilistic flood inundation map for Tonawanda Creek in western New York. So, to assess the morphological changes from the 2016 flooding, digital elevation models from pre- and post-flood would be used. A technique to assess elevation changes would then be applied. Negative elevation changes represent erosion, and then positive elevation changes represent deposition. An estimate of the net sediment budget of the river would then be calculated. To create the hydrologic models, HEC-RAS would be used, which is a simple steady-state one-dimensional hydraulic model. These models would be built and refined using the 2016 flood data. Projected flows from the future flows hydrology database would then be input into both of these models. The next step would be to create probabilistic flood maps. The inundation rasters from HEC-RAS would be exported into ArcMap and new rasters would be made. The rasters would be reclassified with either 1 or 0 to symbolise which cells did or did not meet the criteria. Probabilities of inundation extent would then be determined by overlaying these inundation rasters, and a percentage would be calculated depending on how many inundations overlap. Lastly, the morphological changes and how they influence flood risk would be assessed. So I would have to quantify morphological changes from the 2016 flood and the impact the changes have had on probabilistic flood risk, and evaluate the probability of flood risk under predicted flows. This table shows an overview of the timeline for the project. Learning how to use HEC-RAS and building the hydraulic models is expected to be the hardest part, but also the most time-consuming part of the project. This is why this task has been placed earlier on in the timeline. Taking into account important dates, on the 7th of March there is an aim to complete the first draft of the project. Thank you for listening, and these are all the references used for this project so far.